Alrighty, folks. Unfortunately, we have fallen just short of the title in Grand Prix Neo Stehlia, but we still had a pretty sweet run, all things considered. So let's talk about how it all went, how I'm feeling about the deck that I brought now that we're on the other side of everything, and how I'm feeling going into my very first World Championships. Before we dive into all the details, as always, links in the description below to all of your key resources to check out all things Revolution Custom Standard, most importantly, that Custom Magic Discord server. Please check it out, join the community, play the format, see the different projects people are working on. It's a lovely time, and we'd love to have you. So, this was a very Dragon Control styled tournament for me. There were only 4 of us in the field on Dragon Control at the end of the day, but boy, oh boy, did that end up dominating the conversation for what I was up to throughout this entire tournament. So, for context, there were only 22 players in the field, so for 4 players to bring the same macro archetype, that's a pretty significant appearance rate. And certainly, there was almost a 75% conversion rate. If we had lost our fourth round matchup, there would have been a 75% conversion rate out of 8 people in the top 8 out of 22. Of course, we did win that matchup and knock out one of our fellow Dragon Control players, but then we had to give every single other Dragon Control player in the Swiss rounds a loss before heading into top cuts. So it was really just ultimately where we were at. And certainly, I think one of the things that has been very enlightening to me is that you can kind of see as my matches progress, if you followed along with every single match I've played this month, you can really see my confidence start to get much more steady and stable. And I start to really piece together how I'm supposed to tackle the mirror matchup to a much more foundational concept. So much of this particular mirror matchup comes down to patience and being able to navigate around mana thresholds. You saw a lot of the times where I was in mirror matchups, especially towards the mid to late game turns, my biggest priority was making sure I was still hitting land drops. And I think that's really important to keep in mind because ultimately land drops are how you can beat out an opposing control player. If you have more mana to make things happen than the opponent, then you can go for an attempt, let them fight over it, and either fight back, or because of where this format's particular counterspell suite is at more realistically, let them deal with your first win attempt, and then make a second attempt on the same turn. And I think that brings me to my first big concern about this deck moving forward, which is that this deck has a lot of absolute counters, which is to say Draconos Magistus and Silent Lakefront are both unquestionable counterspells. They are both counterspells that cannot be fought back against. They do not instigate stack wars. They just end the conversation then and there. There is, I believe, one singular option in white and colorless that can stop these spells from countering something, and that card rotates next season. So we're heading into next season with 2 counterspells available for white and blue control decks between Magistus and Silent Lakefront that are just unconditional. You stop a spell, the opponent cannot fight back against it. Now, obviously, the thing that you can do to fight back against it, as we saw in that finals match, is just out-tempo the control deck. But realistically, if the control deck is able to get its feet underneath it, they can stop any major spell you go to cast. So that puts a lot of pressure on mid-range and control strategies to either have cheaper threats, which pushes curves lower, or have uncounterable threats, which we saw a bit of with End of Mutations in round 3, but as round 3 kind of made apparent, uncounterable threats don't just win the game by their lonesome. They can absolutely be bested with some lucky draws and some careful navigation. So, I'm a little nervous about the counterspell suite moving forward because Silent Lakefront is in the format for another year, and it's not a card that's very easy to change. Certainly this is not something that you really want to add a complicating rider to. You don't really want to make it counter target spell unless its controller pays like 3. Certainly that could make it easier to play around. But for 5 mana to discard this card for what is effectively a channel ability already, by 5 mana, that is a lot to demand for what is functionally just, or what would functionally just be a mana drain at that point. Not mana drain, mana leak. So, certainly that's not the correct way to approach it. Perhaps maybe it would want to have a limitation on what types of spells it can target. But I think ultimately, Silent Lakefront's maybe the more excusable of the two, if only because, first off, it will have less time remaining in the format, but also it's 5 mana. I do think that there are worlds where we could see this card being something that could have real interaction picked up for it. But unfortunately, because this is a land source, the curators are so cautious about providing anything that can disrupt activated abilities of lands because of basic fetches. And if we can stop basic fetches, then we can stop Silent Lakefront. Or rather the other way around, if we get a way to stop the Silent Lakefront ability, then we get a way to stop basic fetches, and that is just not healthy for the format long term, which puts the pressure on Draconos Magistus. Now, I think it's very reasonable to say at this point that everyone, not everyone, but a majority of people kind of have been sitting on Iviana in the back of their minds, if at all, for the last year. This is the 4th season we've had GQ Chaos Reigns. Iviana's been around for over a year and hasn't really made much waves. Certainly when Gration was printed the following season, there was a little bit more attention towards Iviana, but it didn't ultimately move the needle a whole lot on Iviana. But the introduction of Draconos Magistus and Asulio the Watchful Star has completely reshaped the context of this card. And so much of that comes down to the -2 here, not only getting a dragon from the sideboard, but also making you 2 untapped treasures, so you can immediately represent either Asulio on turn 5, or rather Asulio when you've tapped out, or Draconos Magistus either on turn 6 or so long as you have 1 other mana up. That just presents so much of a hurdle for the opponent to try and reasonably punch through that it kind of just invalidates a lot of attempts to try and remove Iviana. And as a result, you can really comfortably just use Iviana as a value tool, wish for 2 dragons, get 4 treasures, or wish for 1 dragon and maybe you wish for a second dragon, then cast a second Iviana. You have a bunch of counter spells up and available, and then you downtick the second Iviana, get a 3rd dragon from the sideboard, cast Gration, cast 1 of your other dragons from your hand, and just punch the opponent for a bunch of damage. Eltanon, certainly, we never really found ourselves wanting too much, but that was in part because we ran into so many control matchups. I could see myself having wanted to fire off Eltanon the Silent Stars Path of Stillness in the finals matchup if I'd ever had a window to stick Iviana. Unfortunately, the games just really didn't ever give me a window to get to that opportunity, but I probably would have wished for Eltanon at some point in that particular matchup. Certainly just seems like getting rid of all of the cheap permanents would have been good there. But yeah, Iviana significantly is significantly warped by the introduction of the Solitaire dragons, and certainly Asulio and Draconos Magistus are the stars of the show. Asulio being a 2 mana negate off of Iviana is monumental. You do not need to leave mana up after Iviana because she gives you the mana to hold up for Asulio. And that really causes some significant problems in terms of how you could reasonably attempt to play around this card. Or get rid of Iviana in any capacity. And Draconos Magistus, again, is uncounterably a counterspell. It says no to just about anything. Yes, there are small examples of cases where this cannot stop what's on the stack, specifically things like End of Mutations or Terminal Impact. But for the most part, if your opponent's going for a win, Draconos Magistus guarantees they cannot do it, and they almost certainly cannot stop you. Which just creates this awkward standoff, especially in the control mirrors, where we both are sitting there knowing that, unlike in traditional control mirrors, where there is a risk of a real stack war, if we go for something important, there is no stack war. There is just someone says you can't do this, and it's done. Which is why this particular mirror match is so defined by being able to go for multiple consecutive win attempts rather than going for a win attempt with counterspell backup. And with that in mind, I gotta say, I was not always super excited by Overrule Will. Certainly, it is a very necessary part of the deck from a basis of just early, stable interaction. But at the same time, I can't help but look at Overrule Will and then look at the other counterspells available to the deck and feel like it just doesn't quite go across the finish line. And you saw one of the big things that I was very hesitant to do that, naturally other players playing the deck were much more inclined to do is target myself with the mill. Certainly it didn't help that I got some situations where I would target myself with the mill and actively regret doing so because I'd mill things that I did not want to lose from my deck. That's purely circumstantial. That's not something that ultimately determines whether or not the targeting yourself with the mill is worthwhile, but it is just a factor of I do not love milling myself when I have so few incentives to fill my graveyard. And there are incentives to fill your graveyard. It rushes your seafloor treasures, it gets your offset daemons in the graveyard, so that way the next one you cast is online. But I often found myself wanting to just cast an offset daemon even with none in the bin, because if it gets removed, I can just cast another one later down the line. And if it gets removed, I can just put the overflow 3 turns down the line, so that way there's room for it to get removed. Just that way I have that, insurance policy overall. So certainly, Offset Daemon, Seafloor Treasures are both reasonable even without the mill. And the mill never really felt like it was the thing that made these cards better. It was just kind of a thing that's there because ultimately, I love Deft Deflection. The countering activated and triggered abilities is just not relevant right now. I really want it to be. I really want Deft Deflection to have a reason to exist in this format. But the fact of the matter is just that this second mode on Deft Deflection has so few relevant use cases. It is to the point where I can't help but wonder if I would rather this second mode be more potent than the counterspell mode, simply because it is so niche as to when it actually happens, as to when it actually matters. And it's niche enough that it's not really worth reaching for Overrule Will. And on that same beat, Cursory Glance, I hyped up a lot when this rotated into the format. We haven't really seen a lot of it, and it's because we've been in such a control-heavy meta, in such a top-heavy meta, that countering cheap spells just has not really been super relevant. It would have been amazing in our finals match, but in every single other one of our matches, this would have been a mostly dead card. Overrule Will can at least present some issues on the stack later on in the game, can present some trouble to the opponent if they're trying to perfectly weave together multiple things in their turn. We can kind of cause a hiccup there with Overrule Will, or get the last spell they're going for in a turn. And that can't really be said of Cursory Glance in the same capacity. So I'm not crazy about Overrule Will. I wish we had a better option than this. But at the same time, it's a quench with minor upside. I think if I could go back, I'd encourage myself to target myself more often. Honestly, part of my rationale for targeting the opponent was always just this thinking of the more ways for them to kill me I can get out of their deck, the better shot I have of closing out the game. And if we really grind this to a halt, the deeper into their deck they are, the more likely it is they deck out before I do. And I think that rationale holds in the mirror matchup. I think the value of getting stuff in your own graveyard is outweighed by how few threats are available to you, and with how much our interaction is unquestionable. Silent Lakefront, Draconis Magistus just saying no Iviana for you, no Offset Daemon for you. it really does present this scenario where you can create a hard lock uh, and push your opponent out of as many possible threats as they could try to reach for. I think if we had a reasonable creature land, that would be a little more suspect. But the only creature land available to blue and red is the only creature lands available to this particular strategy are the blue-red one and the red-white one. The blue-red one requires you to have a creature on board so it can clone that creature. The red-white one is a 2/2 that anthems your other creatures with +1 power when it attacks, and neither of those are particularly great for a control strategy like this. So I think the way I'd recommend approaching this mirror match if you ever find yourself playing this deck is definitely think about how you can limit your opponent's access to threats, so that way you can kind of just bleed them out of avenues to victory. One of the things that I saw Caillou note was that they felt very happy with their choice to go for 3 Thistral Charms in the main rather than the full playset of Terminal Impacts. And by their rationale, I also like the fact that I brought Terminal Impacts as the full playset rather than predicting their change up between the main board and sideboard, because ultimately one of the things they noted is that the Thistral Charms are better in the more mid-rangey matchups. This has more text, more relevant text in the early to mid game, and has more flexibility in those contexts. Whereas Terminal Impact is a more relevant control matchup card. And sure enough, because 4 out of my 6 matches in this tournament were control matchups, 5 really, because I'd point to the red-white Big Boros deck and say that's absolutely still a control matchup in my opinion. 5 of our 6 matchups were control matchups where Terminal Impact absolutely got to make a difference because we had so much time, so much leeway to develop our mana that this could be either an early removal spell or a way to completely shut the door on the opponent. And when we're talking about ways to bleed the opponent out of resources, out of interaction, Offset Daemon can do some work. Draconos Magistus can maybe do some work. Iviana can be great if you can slip Iviana through. Terminal Impact, you do not ever have to worry about the opponent being able to stop this. Draconos Magistus, also uncounterable, but is still vulnerable to removal like Fateful Ascent. Terminal Impact can't be removed. And so as a result, this just gets to be such a good anti-control card when you're matched up to the mirror. So I think I agree with Caillou's assessment that if you're blindly going into a field, the Thistral Charms do look a little bit better than Terminal Impact. But Impact, I think I was very glad to have the playset in my main board for this GP, given the opponents I matched up into. Otherwise, for the most part, there's really not much I would change in terms of numbers. The one thing I saw Caillou stating that was definitely a whiff, and I'm inclined to maybe agree, is Stargazing as it is should have probably been a playset, or at least a 3 of rather than a 2 of. This card is just so monumentally important for sculpting early turns. It can really define the early to mid game, and we saw that as people started really putting pressure on Stargazing specifically in our top cut matches, where this was getting countered in the early turns, so that way we couldn't sculpt into the later turns of the game. But I also think one of the things that's valuable about Stargazing is that I talked a lot about referring to this as an opt where you can transform a card from your hand into another opt. There's also some nice value to Stargazing in letting this just be opt. This doesn't have to get rid of anything in your hand. The flexibility to decide whether anything in your hand is worse than an opt in the current situation, or if you'd rather hold on to everything for future turns, is nice. If this was mandatory, it would be worse, which I think is not a crazy sentiment to share here. Now, I'm not going to dance around things too much. The patch notes have been foreshadowed as far as what is being looked at to change for next month. I'll go into this in more detail once it is formally confirmed as the updates for next month. You can expect the patch notes video to come on April 1st. No fool's jokes here. there are 2 hits coming to this strategy, one of which is 2 stargazing. It is losing the return to hand clause and losing the limitation how many times you can cast spells named stargazing in a turn. To instead have it so you may discard a card to exile stargazing from the stack and cast it later for as long as it remains exiled, so long as stargazing was originally cast from your hand. So it becomes something you can only do twice rather than something you can do in perpetuity. But honestly, I think it's still really good. And the take I have is if we could find a way to squeeze Overrule Will out of the deck, I think it just fully replaces Seafloor Treasures. Now, I don't know if there is an easy way to squeeze out Overrule Will. Again, like Deft Deflection and Cursory Glance don't really step up to Overrule Will ultimately. But at the same time, Deft Deflection does what Overrule Will does in a lot of cases. It's just the mill that it doesn't do. So if you care less about your graveyard, if you don't have Seafloor Treasures in your deck, or you don't have as many Seafloor Treasures, maybe it could be fine to just run Deft Deflection, and in the like 1 in a million chance where the Stifle mode comes up, you have access to that over the mill. Yeah, I do think Stargazing really does want to be in here. This card is just very, very solid. Caillou had very positive thoughts about 3 Become 1. I'm kind of split on it. 5 mana draw 3 at instant speed is certainly fine, and especially a little bit better when you get the free cast value. But there are not many things that this deck is looking to free cast off of this. There were just a lot of windows where it was like, okay, I'll free cast a Seafloor Treasures, or I'll free cast a Stargazing, or I'll free cast maybe I'll free cast a Path of Prudence. Path of Prudence off of 3 Become 1 certainly really good, but especially in the control mirrors, it's just simultaneously something you really, really want to resolve, and something that just feels like there's no clean window to try and go for it. And certainly, if there is a window to go for 3 Become 1, I'd rather be going for Iviana or Offset Daemon if at all possible. One of the things that I've been thinking about is if you do want to keep Overrule Will, if you do want to keep Seafloor Treasures, perhaps the avenue is to look at Discern. Because obviously, this is a cantrip that has some value later on. But one of the things that Discern does that just kind of slips under the radar is this is 4 mana to draw 2, which has always been a pretty respectable control piece. Never the best draw spell available to control decks across customer canon history, but it's certainly not embarrassing by any means, and I do think this could absolutely be a relevant option to reach to for control decks as well. The only reason I think it's not really quite there compared to Stargazing is just that Stargazing digs a little bit deeper, looks a little bit deeper, and can get additional value for cheaper than Discern can. But ultimately, if you do get value out of Stargazing by way of returning this to your hand, or I guess post-patch exiling it to recast it a second time, you ultimately aren't really digging, or sorry, then the copy of Stargazing you're getting, or sorry, no, I'm faltering here a little bit. I think Stargazing actually post-patch certainly looks better than Discern in the vacuum. It is just, if you're looking to keep the Overrule Wills, perhaps Discern gets a little bit better because there is that flashback value. Fights a little bit with Seafloor Treasures in terms of how much mana you're spending to get it out of your graveyard, but Discern and Seafloor Treasures, I think, are a natural pair. I think maybe Discern wants to be around Seafloor Treasures a little more often than Stargazing, but Stargazing is also a really powerful card, so it's a bit tricky here. The one big card that I felt was absent in all of this is Lunar Awe. This card just does a lot of relevant things right now in terms of checking the board. It fills a very similar role to Thistral Charm in a lot of ways because of how good Thistral Charm is at just, picking off creatures and interacting with the stack. And I think Thistral Charm is better than Lunar Awe in a couple matchups, but I do also think that there are some very relevant things that Lunar Awe does that Thistral Charm just cannot step to. And the two really important ones there are Offset Daemon, where this getting damaged by a Thistral Charm does not stop you from getting the overflow, but getting damaged by Lunar Awe does prevent the overflow. And then the other big one is Survivors of the New World, where damaging this with a Thistral Charm gets the opponent the value, they still get the tokens, but if your opponent casts a Survivors of the New World and you target it with Lunar Awe in response to its Enters trigger, you prevent both of the tokens from being created because it counters all of the triggered abilities on the stack, and it removes all abilities from that target until end of turn, so they also don't get the death trigger either. I think those two effects combined really make Lunar Awe appealing, considering some of the most valuable 4-drops in the field right now are things that really get hosed by Lunar Awe between Offset Daemon and Survivors of the New World. I can't say for sure if that sentiment will hold into the next season, but certainly Offset Daemon and Survivors of the New World are both going to be around next season, and Lunar Awe is going to be here for another 20 months. So we're going to have 21 months, because we're not done this season quite yet. So Lunar Awe is going to be, I think, popping up a little bit more here and there. I can't say what I would necessarily cut for Lunar Awe, but this was another card I was thinking about as perhaps wanting to try and find a way to squeeze in here. Otherwise, a lot of the stuff that didn't feel very good, stuff like Clash at Orithcross and Deafening Clarion, we just didn't run up into the matchups where these would have been good. So ultimately, I can't say whether or not they would have been amazing. From the sound of things, Caillou was not overwhelmingly impressed with Clash at Orithcross, and certainly, there were cases where I kept it in the main deck with the idea of perhaps trying to target it with some removal to make the 2/2s, or target with a little bit of burn, or swing an Offset Daemon at it to get some 2/2s. Never really had a window where I wanted to make that go. Perhaps I should have been boarding it out a little bit more aggressively. Ultimately, I think I'd want to have more reps against a more diverse field to really get a beat on whether or not I like Clash at Orithcross in this list. Deafening Clarion is not something we need to have a conversation about. It's just good. Fateful Ascent is really good. It's just a bummer that this misses battles. That certainly did matter in our finals match there. I can't confidently say whether or not I'd want there to be enchantment-based removal. Certainly, the lack of type agnostic removal that our Banishing Light variants offer to us, being absent from this particular suite was painful in the face of battles in particular, but that didn't really matter up until the finals, so I don't know how comfortable I'd be with saying that it was like a deck-defining miss by any means, and certainly those options being primarily sorcery speed does hurt. And then the one that's instant speed, requiring you to be on a lot of planes, not very conducive to a 3-color mana base. So, yeah, just kind of an awkward mismatch overall there. Talking about the sideboard a little bit, Heliolay Spires, we just didn't really run into a matchup where they were relevant. There were some matches in the field where this would have been very important. Specifically, Reanimator did pop up this GP as it has popped up the last couple GPs in the hands of Ricky Rister. Heliolay Spire would have been pretty good in that matchup. I still stand by, I think it would have been pretty good in the finals match that we had. We just never really found it, so it never really got to attempt to stop, discern, or block any creatures. But I do think Heliolay Spire, not a terrible card still. I think it's still very reasonable. Looming Psyhawk, I continue to feel very medium on. I think it's unquestionably like a sound card to include in your sideboard because it is such a unique and relevant effect, given how often tokens can really be prevalent across the format. Finding matchups where people just don't make tokens ever is really rare, and ultimately, this is something that can be pretty safely boarded in place of things that just don't really work in particular matchups. But I do think Psyhawk does have some falter points where I'm like starting to wane on it, and ultimately that's maybe not a terrible place to be with Psyhawk, considering it's got one more month until it rotates. But I don't think I'll be thrilled to see it rotate. Psyhawk certainly does play a very necessary role in the format, and it'll be sad to see it leave in May. I talked about Thistral Charm already a bit, but certainly this card is very good, and I understand why it's here in place of Lunar Awe. I do think there is a world where you want to try and split this and Lunar Awe together, but I'm not sure which one would necessarily want to be more prevalent. And certainly Thistral Charm does a lot of very important, relevant things. I think if we had a battle we were still looking to damage, I'd be a little higher on Thistral Charm. But ultimately, Clash at Orith Cross is not enough reason to want to damage a battle with a burn spell. And I guess Lunar Awe is worse at that because if we target our own battles, we strip away any triggered abilities we might be getting from those battles. So not amazing in that regard. But because there's not really many battles we're looking to point the Thistral Charm at, per se, that is something where maybe we just would rather have the Lunar Awe because there's no reason we want to be pointing burn at battles particularly. Because things like, countering Iviana, Thistral Charm can counter Iviana, but if the opponent goes for an Iviana down tick immediately, Lunar Awe can also stop that by killing Iviana and countering the activated ability on the stack. So a bit tricky. I do think Thistral Charm justifies itself very reasonably, but I might want to dig into the Lunar Awe inclusion a little bit more deeply with that in mind. And then the one big one that I really started to wane on overall, even as I kept boarding it in the control mirrors, I'm torn on Syscall. I think it's a totally reasonable card, but I find myself really struggling to want to pay in a lot of mana to draw a bunch of cards. And I also struggle to find myself really wanting to rush this into play early, despite there not being a whole lot that this deck has going on early, if only because I do not want to let my guard down on the early turns when I could hold up interaction for anything my opponent tries to go for in the early turns. If I can try and stop what they're up to a little bit more effectively, a little bit more efficiently, I want to do that rather than trying to develop a Syscall, and Syscall kind of just doesn't do enough for me to really love it. There are two cards I could think of as maybe wanting in place of Syscall here. One is, and I think maybe should still have been in here, I think Path of Scales is still largely a reasonable card, and I'd like Thistral Charm a little bit more if we still had access to Path of Scales here. I certainly don't think the draw value of Path of Scales is as good, and obviously double the mana cost over Syscall. But again, I don't think you really want to be rushing Syscall out early every single time. And importantly, this will cost you more mana long term than Path of Scales because it is going to be asking you to really pay like 2 or 3 or 4 mana into it every single time it rolls around to eke out the most value. Whereas I'd rather have Path of Scales, even if there's not a lot of great stuff to copy with the defeated mode, just having access to a dig spell like Stock Up that gets to stick around on the board and potentially shrink my opponent's creatures. The flexibility there is really nice. And again, if you can defeat it, there is some real value that can be had through, copying up Stargazing, copying up Terminal Impacts, copying up Seafloor Treasures, or 3 Become Ones, or making Overrule Will a little bit better in the late game, making Overrule Will a little bit more of a relevant win condition in the late game, the mill becoming a little bit more serious. And the other potential draw spell I'd want to see in place of Syscall, it's honestly 3 Become One, or Discern. I don't know if 3 Become One necessarily wants to be in the main here. There are definitely situations where it's just way too slow to be present in the main deck. I don't think I really should have had it around for the red-white matchup in round 3. Certainly, I do not remember if I kept it in the main deck in the finals, but if I did keep it in the deck after sideboarding, I really should not have. I don't believe I did, but I don't recall specifically. But yeah, it's just this case where I don't love Syscall. I do not love it where it's at. I do absolutely agree with the sentiment that this should not have been 1 mana. I'm glad it got nerfed up to 2 mana. I don't think it's unplayable at 2. I certainly understand why it's here. I understand why Caillou was playing it. I understand why people might continue to play Syscall. But I think for me, I have faltered on why I like it overall, specifically because it requires you to invest so much mana on your own turn, where this being a control mirror breaker starts to look a lot more awkward because it gives your opponent more opportunities to pinch you on mana during your turn rather than the alternative happening. And I think we saw that. If I remember correctly, there was a case where one of our opponents got a Syscall into play and they activated it, drew a couple cards, and then we just got to pinch them on their own turn on their end step because they would have had more mana to fight us on the stack between their end step and our turn that they just couldn't actually do because they paid into Syscall. Um, so yeah, I don't hate Syscall, but I feel like I'd rather just have either instant speed draw between three become one, or discern, or just more immediacy with Path of Scales with the potential long-term value between the 3 defense mode and the defeated mode. But yeah, that is the Iviana Jeskai Dragon Control list. That's how I've been feeling about the list throughout my playthrough of this GP. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be thrilled about the way the finals match went. Going Mana Screw into Mana Flood against the Tempo deck is just not where you want to be. But ultimately, variance happens, and I think I mentioned this in the finals. I got so lucky through so many of my matchups prior to that point that for as much as I felt a little bit burned by the variance in that finals match, variance was on my side for a lot of the runs. So I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Second place is still a really great performance. I kind of faltered towards the very end of the Curator's Cube tournament as well, but I went 3-1 in the Curator's Cube tournament as well. So 8-2 across both tournaments this month. I feel pretty proud of myself for how much I kind of really fought through some very tough matchups in both tournaments with decks I'm really not necessarily the most proficient with. I do not have a ton of experience playing Control in Magic, and certainly with Curator's Cube, I played a green-white creature mid-rangey strategy, which is also not something I am very frequently doing when I'm cube drafting. I'm usually looking for a little bit something a little bit greedier. So to be playing the very honest deck and going 3-1 there felt really good as well. So overall, very proud with how I did this month. I would have loved to take the crown here, but I will absolutely settle for second place. Well done to CFT Sock once again. I look forward to maybe getting a revenge match of sorts in World Championships if we match into each other. See if I can't push myself a little bit harder and get luck to go a little bit more my way there. And yeah, the format as a whole, I'm very curious to see how it will shake out for Worlds. I mentioned the patch that's coming. I talked about one of the two changes because Stargazing feels like the change that's more relevant, but there is also a change to Duration that's coming. Specifically, that Duration's going up by 1 mana, so you cannot consistently go Iviana on curve, down tick, and guarantee Duration next turn. You do still have to hit an untapped land on turn 6 to cast Duration. But ultimately, I don't know if that's so backbreaking to this deck that it eradicates this deck, and I do think the Stargazing change is not enough to eradicate this card either, especially in the early rounds. You saw I was absolutely casting Stargazing twice, and the second time I was casting Stargazing, I was just putting it in the graveyard. So I think this is still a totally reasonable card with the change. I think Duration going up to 8's a bit of a bummer, but I don't think it's completely irrelevant, in part because I think while Duration is the proactive finisher component to Iviana, the interactive component to Iviana is just so strong that I don't think there's any reason to be down on Iviana because of the Duration change, necessarily. The proactive line's a little less reliable, but I think the control deck can get away with being a little more patient on its proactive lines. So yeah, I'm very curious to see how the format shapes up. Obviously, the big focus was hitting Iviana control and hitting mono red Solidarity with a little bit of a nudge towards other decks leaning on things like Stargazing. But I'm very curious to see how the format shakes out because I can't help but feel like the nature of this GP was such that people were very specifically not bringing the decks they thought were the absolute strongest in the field, so that way they could surprise everyone with those decks at Worlds. So we'll see what people are cooking up. I have a few rough ideas on what I want to bring to Worlds. I have no idea what I'm going to settle on specifically. If I did, I certainly wouldn't tell all of my competitors here. But we'll see where I land, where everybody else lands. I look forward to that decklist stream. That's going to be a wild time going over everybody's lists, and I look forward to my very first World Championships run in just a short time away. So thank you so much for tuning into this entire run. Thank you for tuning into this very, very long final thoughts video. I know for not talking about my overall thoughts on the Solitaire season, yes, I still have more thoughts on the Solitaire season beyond what I've discussed here. For not talking about all of that because we have another standard tournament ahead of us. This has been a very long video, and I appreciate you all for sticking out with it if you have. If you haven't, obviously, you're not hearing this bit. But this has been an absolute blast. I love getting to have a long run like this, even if I kind of stumble onto my face at the end. Because it means I just get to play more Magic, and I get to play more Magic for all of you to watch and enjoy. You can enjoy my flubs, you can enjoy me getting flustered, and you can enjoy me kind of navigating things to the best of my ability. You can see how my brain works when trying to parse out these tricky matchups. And I look forward to hopefully getting to bring you all some very fun match coverage next month. I don't know if I'll be playing the Grand Prix next month. If I do, I probably won't be making videos on it just to really focus in on Worlds. But you can all expect Worlds coverage for my run at the very least. And even if I don't go far, you can also expect Finals coverage for Worlds here next month, as well as our May rotation set reviews for the 2 unknown sets joining the format in just a short time. I'm very excited for the future. We've got a lot of fun stuff coming up. I'm excited to play Archaeologist for any of you looking to try that out. I'd like to at least give it a shot. And wish me luck on sorting out what I'm going to play at Worlds. So until next time, until the patch notes for April go live and I get to see you all here on April 1st, hope you all take care, and I'll see you all in the Revolution chat. Bye-bye.